Well, welcome back, independent thinkers. We have a very different type of show today. As normally it's me just doing a talking head, and as a general rule on the show, we don't have guests. However, today I wanted to make an exception because you have Julie. She's available, and she made, I think, one of the greatest documentaries I've ever seen covering on communism, and it's something that's not talked about enough here in the United States. It's such a danger to us in our way of life, and I believe personally that the Democrats, they were one election away from finishing their communist revolution in 2024. I really believe we're that close to losing all of our freedoms and our rights. Julie has spent a massive amount of her life studying this, I believe all the way back to high school, if I understand right.
College.
College? Okay. So how about you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about who you are?
Yeah. So I'm Julie Behling, and I wrote a book called Beneath Sheep's Clothing, The Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR and Parallels in Today's America, and was able to make a documentary, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, that came out last year. And it was the documentary from start to finish, all the different steps, over 20 years in the making. And I took Russian when I was in college. And I don't know what part of my story you want me to share, but it's kind of a weird story. It seemed to choose me. It was a bunch of coincidences as to how I got into studying Russia and everything like that. But I don't know what parts of it you want me to tell. But
sure. Let's start out just in case people don't understand what communism is. You start with that.
Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough. Communism. Well, if you talk to, college students today who took their political science class and they learned from their subverted Marxist professor what communism is, you get one definition. If you talk to someone who is really focused on different, philosophy, then you'll get their definition. My definition is based on the fruits of communism. So it's probably not satisfactory to a purist who wants like a real pure, philosophical answer. And then the subverted Marxists don't like my definition of communism. I mean, communism, it's implementing socialism through force at the point of the gun barrel against your head. You don't want to go along with it, we'll kill you. So, and it ends up being the deadliest system that we've seen. It's, over 100 million deaths in the 20th century from the government killing their own people, not from like warfare, but from governments killing their own people through purges, famines, executions, mass executions often, because they didn't want to go along with the utopia, or somehow they got accused of something. And Marxism is the ideology that helps a society prepare to accept communism or to go into communism, and it harnesses grievance. And on planet Earth, you look around the history of the world, it's not hard to find people who have some grievance, and usually there's some justification for that. A lot of people have gotten a raw end of the deal. So what Marxism does is it harps on that, and it weaponizes that grievance to cause people, such as the classical Marxism, it's the proletariat, the working class people, to be riled up to tear down their oppressors, the bourgeoisie, the people the middle class and upper class. And it's a power grab. It's all about power dynamics with Marxism. You have to view everything in terms of who has power, who doesn't have power. We have to get more power. And it's just a very dysfunctional, toxic, deadly, evil system.
So the government side, I understand, because you brought up about power, and so this gives them the vessel to have power over people. But if you're a person, why would you go for this? Why would you give up your rights and freedoms to these communists?
Yeah, so communism, that's a great question. Communism, it's a way for a tiny elite to get a mass consolidation of all power in the name of doing it for the people, for the little guy, for the underprivileged person. And so people are brainwashed through propaganda to believe that this system is going to somehow benefit them and their family and their friends and the little guy.
Yeah, it's not like they'll use, and here in America, like equity, for example, right? Is communism promises the outcome.
Yeah. So communism is supposed to be this utopic society where, you know, everyone is equal, there's no one who is going without, and no one is being left behind, and everyone is, you know, in common, holding all of the collective goods of society. But on planet Earth, we haven't found a way for that to work. And then, you know, again, with communism, they're trying to force people to have this by the way, godless utopia, because they want to leave God. They actually want to make themselves God. The state becomes God, and the leader of the state becomes God in a sense. And they want to leave God behind, set up their godless heaven on earth. It's really an inversion of Christianity. Communism is. It weaponizes good intentions of people. It also capitalizes on people with sociopathic, psychopathic tendencies, who are the ones who seem to rise through the ranks the fastest in such a system. It's something we should want nothing to do with in America and the West. And unfortunately, it's made really great inroads. It's been infiltrating the West for over 100 years.
Yeah, I really want to talk to you a lot about that, because communism it happens so slow that people don't really realize it. It does over generations. Before we get in that, let's talk a little bit about your background. So, what interested you into communism, and then how did it translate to Russia?
Wasn't interested in communism. I took Russian in college. I took I think 5 semesters of Russian. I had to take a foreign language. I was studying biology actually in college, and I ended up taking a couple more semesters than I had to take. And I was going to register for Spanish. That's what I'd taken in high school. And the night before I was going to register for classes my sophomore year, and forgive me if this sounds woo-woo, but I had a dream. And in my dream, the 2 people that I knew were speaking in Russian. And I really wanted to speak Russian in this dream. And the 2 people in my dream speaking Russian, one of them actually did speak Russian at the time. The other one didn't, but then did later on. And anyways, that's a whole other long story. So I ended up registering for Russian. My brother had taken Russian in high school in the mid 80s when we lived in Texas. And so he taught, like, we had a dog named Sabaka growing up, that's the word for dog in Russian. And so I had a little bit of exposure to it, but not much. So I took 5 semesters of Russian in college. Then I decided to go be a missionary for the LDS church. And you don't pick where you go, but I was told I would probably end up going to Russia because of my Russian language background, even though I couldn't hardly say anything in Russian, even with 5 semesters. And I did end up getting sent to Russia. And so I was there for a year and a half. It was, that's a whole other story. Interesting, crazy, wild experience. And I came back to the US. So that was in 1997, 1998. So it was just a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So my first real exposure to communism, besides just like the normal, you know, 80s and early 90s upbringing of communism is bad, that's the evil power and we're good in America, which is true. Besides that, my first real exposure to communism was living in Russia a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And excuse me, that was quite an education for me. I met a lot of very deeply traumatized elderly people, especially. Of course, you know, that was a really chaotic time for Russia. You know, just a few years after, you know, so the Soviet Union collapsed in basically 1990, 1991. And it left a lot of people hanging, people who had been depending on the government for everything. And then there was kind of a power grab there in Russia, and there was like the mafia grabbing power and oligarchs grabbing power, and a lot of people, you know, falling between the cracks. Anyways, even with all of that chaos, there was freedom of religion. There were many more freedoms than they'd previously had. And it was kind of like, it was a really interesting time to be in Russia. But I came back to the US, and it was a few months later that I started a graduate program in Russian language and literature. And how that even happened, it chose me. I didn't choose it. I had already finished my undergraduate degree before going to Russia on my mission. I came back and I kind of like had to figure out what to do with my life. I was recruited for the Russian department at Florida State, they needed someone to teach beginning and intermediate Russian and be in the graduate program. And so they asked me if I wanted to do it, and it ended up being a good fit. So I did that. And then I saw there was another degree that I could get, excuse me, along with it, Russian and East European Studies. So I ended up getting this dual master's. And it was for my Russian and East European Studies degree that I had the option to write a master's thesis. Didn't have to write the thesis. I could have done the comprehensive exams. I just kept feeling really drawn. I had done some research for other classes, Russian history, Soviet history, and some other classes through my degree program, kind of delving into the cultural history, the religious history, and of Russia and the Soviet Union, things that happened to Christians in the Soviet Union. And I just felt really drawn to study the dissident Christians, the underground Christians in the Soviet Union, which I had actually met some when I was in Russia as a missionary. So that was the genesis for Beneath Sheep's Clothing.
Now, that was what introduced you accidentally essentially to communism. Was you lived there, you saw it, and then you came back into here and began to study it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I saw the aftermath and I saw the impact on people. And then I go into my graduate program. My major professor for my Russian language and literature program was herself Russian. She was a dissident and she hated communism with a passion, like hated, and rightly so. She actually, the way that she got out of the Soviet Union in the late 70s, that was very unusual. And she was not Jewish. Very, very unusual for her to get an exit visa to leave the Soviet Union. She told the story one time of how that happened. She sent a letter to the government, the Soviet government, saying that if they did not give her an exit visa to leave the country, she would set herself on fire on the steps of the American embassy in Moscow on such and such a date. If they did not give her the exit visa by such and such date, she would be committing this act of protest and suicide. And she got her exit visa the day before she was going to go through with it.
Wow, so, that's incredible.
Yeah, but taking all of and her focus was Russian Soviet literature, taking these or 20th century, 19th century Russian literature, taking the 20th century Russian literature class with her, where we're learning and reading these literary works and a lot of dissident literature, because that was her focus, dissident literature. The literature of the dissidents going into the Gulag and all these various things. I took that class the same semester I was taking 20th century Russian and Soviet history for my other degree program. And I was so shocked at what I learned. History that, we all learned about the Holocaust. We all read the Diary of Anne Frank, as school kids. I don't know if they still do. I'm not sure what's going on today with that. But when I was in school, we did, but I didn't learn anything about the Gulag, didn't learn anything about way more people put to death in the Soviet Union. I literally cried almost every day that semester, reading all of this horrifying stories of things that had happened to the people of Russia. So
yeah, it's truly terrifying. I don't either. I think they're too busy. And when I was in school, they were too busy telling us that the ozone layer was going to kill everybody, and that was the big threat.
Nice.
Yeah, there's a big hole in the ozone layer. That was the big climate change. I don't know which generation each of you are from. Also, over on X Spaces, I see people starting to log in. If you want to ask Julia a question, raise your hand or request a mic. We'll get you up here, and we'll get as many questions in as we can. So you start to get introduced into the communism, and you see the aftermath happening in Russia. Then when did you make the connection of what was happening here in the United States?
Yeah, that's a whole other story. So it took me 2 years to working on my thesis on underground Christians in the Soviet Union. And by looking into them, I was looking at the tactics of the Soviet state to try to destroy Christianity also. And so I was delving into, and this was sorry, I'm kind of old. I wrote my thesis and researched my thesis basically in the old school way. I did have dial-up internet at my house, but you couldn't do research on the internet to any great degree at that point. It was all like interlibrary loan and like microfiche and like all the crazy stuff. So I spent 2 years just completely immersed in all of this, writing my thesis. And then I was like, I defended my thesis, I graduated, but something all along the whole time I was working on my thesis, I felt there was actually a purpose, that there was something that I was going to be researching and learning about that I was going to have to do something with that information later on. I just didn't know what it was. Maybe I was thinking maybe there would be some kind of tyranny that would try to come to America, and there would be some truths that I had researched that maybe would be helpful to Christians. That was kind of what I was thinking. So it was so I defended my thesis and graduated in 2004. And then it was in 2008 that I was just, going about my life and like paying attention to like current events a little bit. And there was something that happened to an extremely unpopular religious sect in Texas that most people consider to be a cult. And this cult had the government came and took all their kids with no due process, with no evidence that the kids were going to be abused or harmed, or that they were being abused. The kids were just taken with no due process and put in state care for their protection. And I was like, wow, that's what this does. So Soviet, that's what the Soviets did to the dissident Christians. They would come and try to round up their kids and put their kids in these boarding school orphanages that were in horrific conditions, where the kids were being indoctrinated into atheism and doing so to quote unquote protect the kids from their evil parents. Mm-hmm. So I looked into this more deeply, and this led me to also what happened in 1993. So that evil cult sect, which by the way is a cult, and I'm not a fan of them, the FLDS, that was what happened in 2008. It made me look into what happened in 1993 with the Branch Davidians. That happened the year I graduated from high school. I think the same, I graduated from high school. I was like a few weeks from graduating when all of that Branch Davidian crazy stuff was happening. And I just totally, whatever the news said about it, I totally believed it all. And that was a shocking thing when I learned what really happened there. Not that everything about David Koresh is all that wonderful. So
right.
This is...
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, this is one aspect so I have in my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, I have a whole chapter on what happened with the Branch Davidians and a whole chapter on what happened with the FLDS. And of course, comparing that to what happened with the Soviet dissident Christians. Not as much of this made it into the documentary, but it's in my book. And that was what led me into it. And I was like, wow, because persecuting the fringe groups was one of the tactics that the Soviets used that I had researched, where they stopped persecuting all Christians after World War II and kept their heavy hand only for the cults. And the cults in the Soviet Union were Baptists, Pentecostals, Seventh-day Adventists. And so they were given the harshest treatment, sent to the Gulag. A Baptist choir master going to the Gulag for 10 years in the 1970s. So, that's just one example of many.
Yeah, it's remarkable how history repeats itself too, and you start hearing it here, because they try to do the same divisional tactics. We're going to go up through a break real quick, but your documentary is free on X for how much longer?
This weekend through Sunday at midnight.
Okay, we're gonna play a break. We're gonna do a little bit different today. I'm gonna play her trailer on the break, so we'll be back in a few minutes. And on Spaces, if you want to come up and ask Julie a question, request a speaker and raise your hand, and we'll get you up here so you can talk to her. So we'll be back in just a few minutes. This is the Cash Loren Show, and we're going to start dividing deeper into communism.
Communism, when it comes knocking at your door, it doesn't say, "Hi, I'm here to impoverish, enslave, and murder you." It says, "I'm here to liberate you from oppression."
I thought of myself as a happy kid. I had no idea that I was being brainwashed.
KGB agents would go into the church and then rise up.
That's right. All of them is infiltrated.
This was a rape of the body of Christ. You take over the colleges of education, then you take over all the teachers, then you take over all the students, and thus you get the future.
He said the ultimate objective of having government school was to destroy Christianity. Those were his words.
People's war means to destroy the opposing country through unconventional methods.
And Khrushchev bragged about it. We'll take America without firing a shot.
In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of American students without being challenged. The result you can see.
There are ravening wolves in sheep's clothing all over the place.
If you are watching this show, then you are probably sick and tired of the corporate media we call fake news lying to you every single day. You are not alone. This has caused many citizen journalism, as much as I hate to say the J word, that's really what we're doing, is exposing the fake news networks and the corrupt government every day without the filter of the corporate media deciding what you can and cannot know. Many of us make these videos with the extra room that we have in our houses, just like I am here in our spare bedroom. But making these is not free. We have families to feed as well. If you are enjoying this content, then it will always be free, and I thank you for your support. But if you want to help monetarily, there's a great way to do that on Locals. Click on the link below, sign up for our different tiered programs, and we will have additional content for you based on the level that you sign up for, including being thanked in the end of videos every single day. Take a moment, if you enjoy this content, and sign up for the monetary support and help us stay on air and offer you more benefits, such as more shows and better production. So sign up for today at Locals and support the citizen journalisms and help us get past the fake news networks. Hey, buttons are not wanting to work today. There we go. All right, so we are coming back. If you're listening, I'm talking with Julie Behling, and she's going through her Beneath Sheep's Clothing documentary that we just played the trailer for. And for those that want to purchase it, where would they find your documentary at?
It's at beneathsheepsclothing.movie. It's also available on Salem now.
It's incredibly in-depth. A lot of documentaries have a lot of filler, but this thing is nonstop, very deep information, very well researched. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. I remember when I first interviewed you, I purchased the streaming version of it so I could watch it before our interview. And then you came out the DVD, and I personally like to own physical media. So I went and bought the DVD as well and watched it again before this interview. It's probably one of the most in-depth, well-researched documentaries I've ever seen. You did some incredible work, and we can't spread the notion enough because this really is communism versus our freedoms.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, I did research over many years, and I was also really blessed in making the documentary that I was able to interview the exact people I wanted to, who had like the most hard-hitting, well-researched information: James Lindsay, Trevor Loudon, Alex Newman, and Lisa Logan, many others who have, put their life into researching various aspects of things. So it's great to be able to work with a filmmaker who also had a great vision. So, and the way the film got funded should not have been funded. I'm just a normal person. I'm not sitting on a bunch of money to be able to make a film. It was really an act of God, honestly, that this film was even made. So I hope people will watch it. Again, it's free on X at the moment, pinned to the top of my profile. Watch it and share it. People, if they're watching this after, go to beneathsheepsclothing.movie.
Yeah, it's well worth it. And it's important to support independent content creators and independent creators like what Julie does, because this is how we get the information out. She talked briefly before the break about fake news and how they covered all of what happened back in the 90s, and they're still doing it all the way up to this day. Is even today, right now, as we can expose them every day, they still continue to blatantly lie to the American public, thinking they can get away with it. In the trailer, and you go much deeper into your documentary and even deeper in your book, you start to talk about education in schools. So a real quick story is this really hit home for me is I was talking to somebody else, and what they told me has always stuck with me. And they said, you could live in the most red state, the most Christian state in the entire United States. And in that state, there's only 10 communists in that entire state. And they said all 10 communists are on school boards, every last one. So that leads to what your documentary talked about. Why do they target schools specifically in children?
They're either on school boards or teaching in a seminary. Why are children targeted? Obviously, because children are the future of a society, and winning the hearts and minds of kids, if you win kids over and change their ideology to fit your specific agenda, then you have the future. And I mean, look, kids are easy to get them to believe whatever, they believe whatever you tell them. So at least younger kids do. So this is why it's really important for us as parents. I have a 10-year-old son who I'm homeschooling, and it's not the easiest thing in the world, but what's happening in our schools now, and look, when I was in school, it was not as severe, not even close to as severe as what's happening now. And look, it's happening now. I literally just interviewed James Lindsay again yesterday for him to give an update on like where things are at. And we talked specifically about education. This crap is all still in the schools with maybe a few exceptions. It's going to take a lot of effort by a lot of people to remove it. But what they're doing with this social and emotional learning, which we talk about in the film, Lisa Logan and James Lindsay talk about it, and we illustrate this social and emotional learning under the guise of teaching our kids things like resilience and inclusion and various other nice sounding things. They're actually very slowly deleting Judeo-Christian ethics as the foundational ideology and replacing it with woke Marxism, with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's very easy to make that shift, but it's actually an inversion of it. So this is why we have these kids coming out of school as social justice warriors, which may be kind of a dated term, as woke Marxists in some cases. There's a lot of kids that have been emerging from high school and colleges too in the last several years, who have very, very strong leftist views, even if they were not raised that way by their parents. But it's even where I live in an extremely conservative part of the country that voted 75% for Donald Trump. I think in all 3 times he ran for president. Like, it's a very conservative area. The AP English teacher at the one high school in my town, I had a run-in with her at a school board meeting a number of years ago. She was pushing the queer Marxist agenda. And then there was a campaign on social media to glorify her and what she was doing. She's an operative. Like, I can't prove it, but she has all the markings of being an operative, a plant. She's not from this area. She's grooming the kids in her after school to go into the whole queer Marxist agenda. And she's a great teacher. So every school, pretty much, according to people I've interviewed, you can expect there to be teachers who are true believers in the cause of subverting kids to Marxist ideologies. And then there's a lot of other teachers that have been just brainwashed by their teacher training.
You touched on some of that. Does everybody that's participating in a communist revolution, do they understand what they're doing? What they're putting towards study?
Absolutely not. No, the communist revolution, people really believe they are on the side of good and truth, because communists marry a truth to a lie. Everyone, look, Black Lives Matter. Let's look at Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter. There is reason for Black people as a whole to have some grievance. They have been treated ill in many instances. Then, you have women going into the whole feminist movement, which is also another branch of, woke Marxism. There's some legitimate grievance there. You have people, gay people that maybe feel like they've been treated poorly. Okay, there's some grievance. That grievance is then, again, it's weaponized. So people have that kernel of truth that it's not right for me to be treated like this. And then it can get all twisted. And then in the case of what's happened in America, it's been twisted beyond all recognition of like people pretty much having to make up how they're oppressed. Fat people are oppressed. That joins the, you know, the whole bandwagon too. So no, people really believe that they are fighting for the right. Now, I'm going to say something that, I mean, I don't know, people won't like this, but the same can happen on our side, where people can be fighting for something that's true, and then that can be twisted and weaponized almost in the exact same way. I'm seeing this happen. Lots of people are seeing this happen with, let's say, white men who are really, really tired of getting treated like garbage, essentially, in many cases by society over the last decade or so. They have that grievance, and that is being then weaponized for some of them to go off the deep end with white supremacy and super crazy stuff. So we have to be careful on both sides, because the Marxist dialectic, as I was interviewing James Lindsay, we were talking about this yesterday, they don't just play one side of things. They have to capture two sides to polarize and get the two polar opposites at each other's throats. And then the power brokers can come in and either maintain their power or seize their power when the two sides are completely clashing and at each other's throats. Again, both sides having some truth on their side, but being led by grievance that is weaponized. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. So on X Spaces, you can come on there. If you're in X Spaces, I'll take a mark and request a hand. We'll try to get you up here. And we have Eddie up here. He's got his hand up, so we'll have him ask Julia a question. Hey, Eddie, how's it going?
All right, brother. Quick question. Besides these wolves in sheep clothing infiltrating the school boards and the clergy, now you don't have to name any specific names, but do you see anybody within the federal government that could be leaning towards communism?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, Barack Obama and Kamala Harris, their whole political careers was funded by a communist who has funded many other people who are in positions of power, including, people in Congress. Oh yeah, it's rampant. I mean, AOC.
That's right.
She auditioned for the role, and she was funded by someone who's with communist intentions as well. There's many, many of them. And you just have to look for their fruits. And by their fruits, you shall know them.
Exactly. No, I thought the same way. I just wanted to make sure that we were on the same page, because I see it clearly in people from Obama to AOC, Bernie Sanders, and quite a few other ones. Thank you for your time.
I mean, Bernie Sanders went on a honeymoon, whatever, to the Soviet Union, and he's been one of the top people, spouting for many decades, spouting off, anti-American, pro-socialist propaganda. So, yeah, and again, it appeals to people because they say that they're for the little guy, to help the oppressed. And anything, again, that's weaponizing grievance. A safe way for us to stay away from this is to not, first of all, get rid of clear our grievance, whatever people's spiritual lives are, that's not my business. But for me personally, forgiveness and various things can help me to not go around with a chip on my shoulder. Also, while I recognize that I have not had as bad of a time in life as other people have in some instances, some people really truly have been oppressed. But if we don't walk around with grievance as our main thing, then we can't be controlled. If we're able to find a way to process that grievance in a healthier way, we can have a much better life and not be controlled by these evil agendas.
All of a sudden, you don't need the Democrats to save you, do you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they essentially get into these school boards most of the time. I know you brought up Christianity too. We'll get in that for a moment. And then it seems like from there it goes on to these Ivy League colleges. And what's the target for why the colleges?
Well, the colleges were subverted first, because that's where all the teachers, the colleges of education, were a heavy target for infiltration. The colleges of social science and all those other too, because to get the educated class of a nation and subvert them. And look how far left. I mean, even like it's so blatant now. Anyone who can't see it is completely blind. But even let's go back a couple decades. Colleges and universities in America are already pushing very far left. There was already a very strong anti-Christian bias, generally speaking, amongst the academics in most universities, with a few exceptions. People were emerging from universities with more left-leaning views on a whole, on average. And it was a slow drip, because the way that I understand it, these Marxists in America tried to launch a revolution. They tried to stage a revolution in the 60s. And that a lot of the unrest on the streets was due to that, but they didn't get the momentum that they needed to completely overthrow America. So they had to go underground. And so those revolutionaries, like the Weather Underground people and a bunch of these other people, they were terrorists. They were dangerous people committing acts of terror in the 60s, and they were communists. Unfortunately, they were let back into society, and they all went into academia and into education to subvert the next upcoming generations of teachers.
Yeah,
And
that makes so much sense because, for example, my wife is a teacher and she has a master's degree. I don't know what she needs a master's degree. I don't even know what she needs a college degree for. I mean, you're teaching most education, and it's out of, let's say, you're less than college. What do you need the college degree for? But if it's to indoctrinate kids, then all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense because they're Marxists, and then they go in, they start teaching these other kids, and it becomes more and more extreme as a generational gap.
yeah, and then it gets really detailed for people, anyone who wants to do a super deep dive. First of all, watch Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and you'll see a lot more of this. But if you want like the deepest of dives, then look into James Lindsay's content on the Marxification of education. Paulo Freire, I don't know how to pronounce it right, a Brazilian Marxist who our whole education system is his Marxist theories that he came up with are taught in all the colleges of education as one of the prime ways of teaching. And it's literally what he taught. That's why kids can't read in America and they can't do math anymore, because education became not about teaching academic skills, but about teaching an ideology to ideologically subvert the kids under the guise of giving them the academic education. And so instead of kids like I'm homeschooling, I have a 10-year-old son. We do grammar, we do spelling, we do math, we do science, and I do also, of course, give him a moral structure. We're Christian, we reading the Bible together and various things. But in the schools, their moral structure is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and communism. And that is what is now embedded into all the subjects through this Marxification of education that is trickling down from all the colleges of education. And it's really crazy when you learn all about it. It's insane.
It was truly horrifying. I remember watching this and reading other books. We're not really taught anything about communism. Most people, you have to essentially, like what you did or what I did, where you kind of fell on your lap, and then you start researching, to where is for me, I just started studying the government, and it kind of came down a rabbit hole, and it kind of led me to what communism was. And I was, one, shocked how prevalent it was, but then two, how few people actually even know anything about that.
Yeah, well, but then they know about it now. They know about it now. The younger people, unfortunately, because they learned that it's a good thing. That's what they're learning about it. And also look at the media. This is another aspect of infiltration of communists capturing Hollywood very, very early on. Are there any major films showing the horrors of communism that you can think of?
No.
What about, there's major films showing the horrors of Nazism, and rightly so. There's tons of World War II, films. There's no mainstream large-scale treatment of the Gulag. There is one major film, The Killing Fields, made about the Cambodian genocide, that happened under Pol Pot. There's that, but it's not part of our mainstream ethos in our media to learn about and know about communism. That's completely deliberate.
I can think of quite a few movies that try to demonize capitalism.
Yeah.
The rich.
Well, and then this is one thing that I go more into in my book. I didn't have time in the film. If you look at like the hero in film, the hero over the last many decades has gotten increasingly less moral. And we think that this doesn't have an impact when we're consuming massive amounts of this media. It absolutely is having an impact. That the heroes of many of the things that we watch are like really depraved oftentimes. Not always, but oftentimes they are.
Or how many Disney remakes do we see now, for example, where they're redoing the old villains, but now they need to tell a new story, how the villain wasn't really a villain. You just misunderstood them, and they were actually the hero.
Yeah, I can't handle these new Disney movies.
Me either.
So
Either. Media in general. I don't even watch TV or almost no movies anymore. When we do, it's the older stuff at this point.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, and we'll watch some new stuff, but I'll like talk to my son afterwards. Like the one Disney movie that I loved, but it's totally subverted, totally anti-male, is that in Encanto? Is that what? Yeah, that it takes place in like Colombia or something. There's no strong male character. All the male characters, and that's the case very, very commonly now. Is you can't have a strong male character, only strong female characters. Anyways.
Why do you think the ones that are towards communism, why do you think they target like male masculinity?
Because it's one of their biggest threats. If the men are feminized and, shut down, then you can more easily control society. If men are strong and aware and free, that's a big threat if you're someone trying to grab power or maintain power.
Yeah, you need the soy boys for Kamala to. Okay, so we have that, and then they target in the schools, and then how do they get into religion, especially Christianity?
Yeah, this one shocked me. So the three major tactics that the Soviets used to destroy Christianity that I researched for my thesis, one of them was propaganda, was mass propaganda on all aspects of society. We're talking in the Soviet Union, to demonize belief in God and to laud the Soviet state. That propaganda was essential. The second tactic was the Soviets stopped heavily persecuting all Christians, and they let other Christians, most Christians, mainstream Christians, have a guise of having their own, of having religious freedom. But they had very, very, very heavy-handed persecution tactics for the fringe groups who were trying to have their faith free from the government. The third tactic was infiltration of the mainstream churches. And this was something in the Soviet Union, after World War II, after the death of Stalin, they realized they'd already tried to decimate and destroy Christianity. It didn't work. It bred tons of underground activity. The underground activity was out of control. There was out of their control. And the Soviet Union was really badly impacted by World War II. Like they had more casualties than anyone else. It really decimated their society. Tens of millions of men were killed off, and the country needed to be able to heal to some degree. So they stopped persecuting all Christians, but they're like, we're gonna send KGB agents into the seminaries to pose as clergy and then control the churches from within. This was easiest for them to do for the Russian Orthodox Church, which already, the main church in Russia, the Soviet Union. It was harder for them to do this for the smaller, different churches that were not mainstream, but they managed to do it. You get into the seminaries, then so you can control the church by actually going into the churches, and from the pulpit, you're saying stuff and it's Soviet government propaganda coming out of your mouth, or you control it by just swaying the clergy to get along more with the government. Oh, we're not going to push back. We're going to support our evil communist dictatorship. Then the Soviet state passed a bunch of laws. Sure, you can practice your religion, but we're going to pass a new law. You cannot bring your children to church, and you cannot baptize anyone under the age of think it was at 21 or 18. You had to be an adult to get baptized. And women's groups and children's groups for churches were not allowed to meet, and churches were not allowed to do charitable work in their communities. So they tied their hands in, and there were more restrictions than that. They had so many restrictions, and so the subverted clergy would be like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to go along with all of this. They basically were just able to nullify the impact of the churches in terms of doing anything in opposition to the government. So another tactic that they use is not necessarily completely applicable to America, but I'll get into how the church was subverted here. They also recruited clergy, and they would actually go into the gulag and find pastors and priests who'd been arrested and sent to the gulag, and they would give them a sweetheart deal early release, a car, an apartment. We're not going to mess with you and your family anymore, but you've got to work for us. You've got to report, even just like you've just got to report what your church is doing back to us. So it's estimated that upwards of 80% of all clergy, Christian clergy in the Soviet Union, were working for the KGB in one way or another, whether directly or a little bit less directly. So in America, how the seminaries were subverted, you have to step back a little bit further, and it's a little bit hinted at in the film. I go into it a little more explicitly in my book, but the people who bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution, according to, there's a lot of evidence for this, it was actually American and European businessmen who without their money, the Bolshevik Revolution would not have happened. And these were some of like super elite people. Well, we had super elite here in America. Rockefeller Foundation was one of the big ones that funded communists to go into the seminaries in America. The Rockefellers were, they were infiltrating every institution. They were taking control of every aspect of institutions that they could, but they were actually bankrolling communists to go into the clergy in America and propping them up. And like one of the pastors or priests who was a big deal at the Rockefeller Riverside Church in New York, and I don't remember which year it was, early 20th century, he went up at the pulpit and denied the divine virgin birth of Jesus. And so that was one of the things that they were spreading, is that Jesus is more of an idea. He's more of like they wanted Jesus to be a social justice warrior. They actually took in America what they focused on, the communists that had subverted. They did try to push things politically left, and they succeeded in that. And they did cast doubt on the divinity of Jesus, on the literalness of the Bible. That was a big one. But they subverted Christianity by shifting it away from an individual's relationship with God, coming back to God through Jesus, through Jesus's sacrifice, and by turning our hearts and souls over to Jesus, that we're redeemed. They wanted to get rid of that part of Christianity, which is the most important part. I think most Christians would agree. And they wanted to shift it towards social justice work. So you can see how Christians would fall for that, because it is important for Christians to help the underprivileged and to help feed the hungry, clothe the sick, etc., or clothe the naked and heal the sick, whatever. That's all a part of what Jesus taught, but they subverted the gospel in that way. And then there was an organization still in existence called the National Council of Churches, and it's gone through a few different names, but the National Council of Churches is an ecumenical organization that the churches that belong to it, they're the most subverted of all the churches. The organization itself is subverted. This organization, and they're like mainline, a lot of mainline Christian denominations have belonged to this organization for many decades. In fact, it started out as a Methodist organization explicitly.
One of the things I hear often, let me know if this is part of the commentary revolution, because one of the things that I often hear the left talk about is they will try to subvert Christ, like you're explaining. One of the things they do, for example, is like the LGBTQ is very famous for a long time. He would bake the cake. when that is very against what Christ was teaching. But this is essentially the same what you're talking about, is we're trying to pervert into leftist ideology.
Yeah, I mean, the woke march into the churches is a more recent one that, like, when I initially did my research for the book, woke was not a thing. I researched and wrote most of my book between 2009 and 2011. And woke really came into prominence after that. And so that was even more shocking to me when all that started happening. And I researched and put that in the book later on when I finally finished it. But initially, yeah, it was more subtle. Things, like I said, we've gotten to the point in the last few years where you have drag queen, some church, like Episcopal Church, is like, bring on the drag queens, baby. And Episcopal Church, and I'm not trying to rag on Episcopals, but they came out a few years ago in support of children having genital mutilation and sex change surgery for children. The Episcopal Church came out explicitly to support it because it's so kind and inclusive. So
how is mutilating a child kind and inclusive?
Well, you can see lots of things can be twisted any which way, and it's kind and inclusive because it's, whatever. You don't need me to explain what their rationale is. And hopefully, hopefully we've already reached peak insanity with that whole aspect of things. We probably have, because too many people are like, no, we're not doing that. Like, sorry, we're not going to go to a church. Like, massive number of Americans won't stand for that in their church anymore. And hopefully we can push it out of the other parts of our culture as well. But, yeah, anyways.
Sure. What point then, so we talked a lot about the Communist Revolution, how part of what makes it so hard to identify is that they will do this very slowly over time. And at first it sounds very good until you start to see in like the deeper and darker parts about it. And we have like here for Tracy, she points out, she says, I grew up in the Methodists and they're not following the Bible at all. And I've seen this through a lot of churches. I actually left the church that I used to go to because they were teaching gay rights. And if you were against gay rights, then you were the problem. And if you were against a gay pastor, well, then you shouldn't even come to their church, because how could you? What would Jesus say? It's completely subverted and crazy, but it happens.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. A lot of people left those churches and went into more evangelical and more Bible-based churches. And then that was great. So when I first wrote my book, when I wrote the bulk of it, it was about 50% that I saw of America's Christian churches were subverted to communism. And then when I finished the book, I finished it. I pulled it out in 2021. I was like, I have to finish this now. And I took several months and I published it in 2022, but I had to catch the book up to the previous decade. And boy, was I in for a shock, because the evangelical churches became under fire from the top down, infiltration, top down, where most of the people are like, what? No, like, where they're teaching critical race theory and like white fragility and various other things, and pushing out pastors that don't go along with that. So yeah, it's pretty bad. So sorry, Tracy had another comment there. I missed that.
Yeah, it was talking about the trans bathrooms.
Trans bathrooms at church.
That was another thing. Yeah,
that's a bit much, Tracy. I agree. Just a bit much.
Yeah, I think a lot of us. I think that was the one point that woke a lot of Americans up, is when they started seeing men going into women's spaces. And I think that was really the spot where people kind of in the mainstream started to realize how crazy this stuff was, that this isn't just baking a cake or being accepting. This is something much deeper. But I know we're getting short on time. And one of the things I want to cover before we run out of is, at what point does the Communist Revolution, does it go from an ideology change to actually becoming violent?
Well, I mean, we have seen it become violent, not like full scale in America, but Antifa and their, various activities that they've engaged in they are explicitly communist, anarcho-communist, which is completely doesn't even make sense. But we have seen violence. When does it become so violent that it overtakes a society? Yuri Bezmenov, who is a Soviet KGB agent who defected from the Soviet Union, and you saw that little clip in the trailer, and have you seen that whole interview with him, with G. Edward Griffin interviewed him in like 1984?
I haven't seen the whole interview. I've seen the clips of it, and I've seen kind of the highlights, but I haven't watched the entire interview. No.
Well, the highlights, and the part that I'm going to refer to now is where he talks about the 4 steps of ideological subversion. And I think that's something that everyone needs to watch. You can find it on YouTube. But step 1 of ideological subversion is demoralization. You demoralize, it takes a generation at least to demoralize the kids within the school so that they will accept socialism, and not just accept it, maybe demand it eventually. And then step 2 is destabilization, where you destabilize a nation's main like important industries and institutions. And for us in America, so this demoralization in America began many, many decades ago. Destabilization most likely began in 2020, March of 2020, with COVID, where you're destabilizing the economy, the medical system, the imports and exports, and all these various other, and then of course, if you can like have there be wars, that's even better. That one takes, they said, I think it's 2 to 6 years, 2 to 5 years, somewhere in that range, where he said to destabilize a nation. So once the society is demoralized, enough people have accepted the enemy ideology, then it's destabilized. Then that's when they come in with the 3rd step, which is basically a hostile takeover of the country. And then the 4th step, they've already taken over, and it's just normalization. So in America, they've probably had to like proceed a little differently, and they kind of did have a hostile takeover, a bloodless one, with putting Biden in office, where they got him a coup to get him in office. America, we're a little bit of a tougher nut to crack. We have a lot of guns. They've had a really hard time getting enough Americans to agree that we need to, give up our arms. A lot of people are not going to disarm. They will pry. It's like pry. Even my mom, my 84-year-old mom, my 86-year-old dad, my mom was like, if they're going to come door to door, I told them they were going door to door to vaccinate people. That was like something being thrown around. My mom was like, well, I'll just take this gun, like, and pry it out of my cold, dead hands. And my mom's a very mild-mannered woman. So not enough Americans have gone along with the whole move to disarm America. So they have to demonize us. They have to demonize Americans who don't want to do that. But
is that the point of the violence, to demonize, to get people to just submit? Is that essentially what it comes down to? Like submission so people will just give the government what they want so that you'll stop hurting them, basically, is.
Yeah, I mean, and then if you look at like just historically, and also to kill the people that won't stand down. But today in our society, they can't just go around killing conservatives yet, and hopefully we don't get to that point. Look, and I have to like again circle back. Thank you, Tracy, appreciate it. I have to circle back because the Marxist dialectic, look, the left lost this election. They're losing the culture war. They still have their hands on these main institutions, and there's also efforts to radicalize on our side, because if you can radicalize both sides, then you can get them to war with each other, and then have your power grab. Because look, it's not just communism that's a threat. Look at China. China's not a pure communist. China is a communist fascist blend. And I think, and I mentioned this in my book, we didn't have time to go into it in the film too much, the model that the globalist agendas want to enact upon the world, it's a hybrid between communism and fascism, and I would say with some monopoly capitalism thrown in there for good measure, where you have like your Amazons and your Walmarts like making bank. Business and government are kind of, you have your private public partnerships or whatever. So they don't, if they can't get, pure quote unquote communism, and that's not even the problem, they'll go on the other side to try to radicalize and agitate. And that is happening. And most of it is probably not organic. Most of it's probably bots and, chaos agents. But we just have to be careful that on the right, that we don't go and start accepting people who are anti-freedom, and because there are people who are flirting with fascism. even some of them kind of big named people flirting with like a power solution for America's conservatives to take back the power. We have our chance. Let's take back the power, and going way overboard with that, in my opinion. So we just have to watch out, because tyranny can be brought about any which way. And these people are playing like, you know, 4-dimensional chess. These people that have been orchestrating all of this. So we just have to be wise.
We're about out of time. So before we run out, is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
No, I think, yeah, I mean, just what I was just saying, I just wanted to cover as well, because I've become more and more aware of it in the last few months, especially the last few weeks. If we see people on our side who are suggesting that we go with like a fascist dictatorship model for America, or if they suggest that we need to go back to segregation. I mean, seriously, we just need to reject all of those anti-American, if we see any of that. And some of this might even come from people who are mostly telling the truth, and whether they're doing it on purpose or not, I don't know. We just need to watch, because our side now, look, the left on X, I'm not battling with leftist trolls anymore, but I've been battling with hundreds of far-right extremist trolls and bots over the last week attacking me. And there's something weird going on, and we just need to be wise. And again, if we're not focused on grievance-based ideologies, and we're focused on Americanism, a merit-based system where it's liberty and justice for all, then I think we're on solid ground.
Hey, well, I really thank you for coming on the show and sharing your story and help us expose communism. Before we wrap up, how do people find you, and how do they purchase your work?
Yeah, so you can watch Beneath Sheep's Clothing if you're watching this right now on X for free on my profile. Julie A. Behling is my handle on X. It's also available
when you're done.
Yeah. And then it's available at beneathsheepsclothing.movie and Salem Now. We're going to be screening it at the Anthem Film Festival next month in Palm Springs, June 11th through 14th. And I have some other projects I'm throwing around, and excited just to promote liberty and to expose tyranny.
Okay, well, I really thank you for coming on the show and sharing your story with us. I hope learned a lot, because it really is. Communism is the ultimate what we're fighting. When at the end of the day, it's God versus Satan, but Satan's using communism to replace God with government. And I think that's really our big battle at this time in this hour. So really appreciate you for coming on. We'll be back Monday. New show time is moved from 2 p.m. Eastern to 8 p.m. Eastern starting Monday. So we'll see you all then, and God bless the USA. Greetings, independent thinkers. We have come to a top of another hour. If you're enjoying this content, please make sure you have subscribed, turn on notifications, but most importantly, share an American First message with your friends and family so we can help fight back against the Democrats and their propagandists over at the fake news networks. Also, take a moment to consider subscribing to us on Locals at the Cash Loren Show, where for a very small amount of money every month, you'll get many additional perks, including your name at the end of videos. I could be up the screen here in just a moment. Follow and increase engagement and exclusive lists on that I use on X. That sounds interesting to you. Go over to locals.com at the Cash Loren Show. Hit the subscribe button for about a cup of coffee a month and help us stay independent and free of the fake news networks and bring you the truth every single day, just like these fine patriots have. At the end of the video, be on your screen here in just a moment.